overlap with the territorial data, so on transport and housing, etc. And it can be supplemented by, sorry, Harry, could you just go back?
Oh, sorry.
It can be supplemented by and compared to individual carbon footprints using similar methodologies, should you want to do that. Next slide, please, Harry. Right, how can we use these measures? Territorial emissions gives you an indication of the sector contributions. So I'll go into that in more detail when those slides come up. But it enables you to open a dialogue with the relevant sectors. So you would have knowledge of the carbon footprint that particular sector is contributing to your community. So you can engage with them on that basis. And it will also enable us to facilitate engagement with district and county councils, where we can influence their decision making to help reduce our emissions. Consumption emissions obviously indicate the household contributions, so you can focus in on the areas within your household that are really generating your emissions. Again, helps us facilitate community engagement, assist us in instigating behavioural change. And it's very important that if we're going to make these changes, that we get our community involved in it. And it also, again, facilitates engagement with the district and county councils. So the next slide, please, Harry. Right, the advantages of a bottom-up approach, or the pros and cons of a bottom-up approach. The advantages, well, smaller and more manageable data sets. Now you can imagine that if you've got a data set that's, say, 500 houses, for example, say, that's a more manageable data set for you to deal with than if you've got 10,000 to deal with. It enables an easier community engagement. So we know our local communities far better than anybody else, so we can easily engage with them. We have invaluable local knowledge, and that local knowledge is essential if we're going to develop strategies for reducing our carbon footprint. And it also enables us to affect change through local engagement. And I'd say behavioural change is going to be key to some of this, but we have to get communities on board. The disadvantages of a bottom-up approach are lack of resources. All right. The smaller councils don't have the time, the money, or necessarily the expertise to deal with it. We have less authority as a local parish council to implement change. All right, so we've got to influence that change at the higher levels. Access to data sets. We may not know what data sets are out there, what data sets we can rely on. So we need to be able to share those with you. And there's a sense of being overwhelmed. It's such a complex issue where all things overlap. So where do we start? So hopefully we can start by establishing our current footprint. So the next slide, please, Harry. Bratton Fleming, described as a large village civil parish. We've got a population of under 1,000. We're on the slopes of Exmoor. The entry at one end of the village, we're 600 feet above sea level, rising to 1,000 feet at the other end. We're off the gas grid. Yeah, and we're in a level 4 wind-driven rain area, so we've got nothing really going for us in terms of protecting our properties. So yeah, everything that can be thrown at us is thrown at us. Next slide, please, Harry. Right, I've graphed up the territorial emissions for Bratton Fleming. And as you can see, agriculture makes up a significant proportion of our emissions. Housing is a fair chunk. So we've got power generation, transport. So as I say, from the point of view of actually recognizing the sector contributions to our emissions, right, we can focus in on those and we can engage with those sectors to say, how are we going to reduce our emissions? Right, the next slide, please, Harry. All right, and in terms of consumption, all right, our biggest contributors are housing, goods and services, consumption of goods and services, travel, they're all three very large ones. And of course, food and diet is playing a very, very big part as well. Now, the way in which I did this, if you notice when you use the tool, the graphs it provides are interactive. So you have to hover over the graphs to actually get the data coming up. But you can actually download the data, and there is a download button which will give you the data in CSV format, sorry, which you can then import into Excel. For those of you who would like more detail on how to do that, we probably need to take that outside of this meeting because we haven't got really time to do that. But if you'd like to get in contact with me, I can set up something for you so I can show you how that was done. And then Harry, if we could look at the next slide, please. All right, so we're now having a look at the average consumption. So you could focus down then for individual households and say, you know, this is your average consumption per household, right? How can you initiate change that will bring about a reduction in your carbon footprint? So it's an important tool for engaging with our communities. So the next slide, please, Harry. Right, and this is the comparison tool that Harry was showing you earlier on. And this is for territorial, and it's done on a per household basis. And what you can see clearly is that agriculture for Bratton Fleming is the most significant contributor to our territorial emissions. Housing is, I'm comparing this with the national average. Now, our housing emissions are far greater than the national average. And that could well be because we're off the gas grid. So we're using fuels like LPG, oil, and electricity to heat our homes. And certainly with oil and LPG, their CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour are far greater than natural gas. So making the comparison, and it doesn't, I'd say the comparisons I've done have all been against the national average, but it helps you explain away where your emissions contributions are coming from. On road transport, we do have a bus service. It runs probably about 7 times, well, more than that, say 10 times a day. But it means that our vehicle usage to commute to work in town or to go to the shops is far higher than the national average. So if I do the next slide, please, Harry. Right, so this is the consumption per household. And you can see again that our consumption totals are much higher than the national average. Housing is a significant contributor to this. And it's possibly because of the poor standard of our housing. Here in Bratton Fleming, yeah, the vast majority of our housing is band D or worse. So obviously the amount of energy that is required to keep those homes warm is certainly higher than the national average. Our consumption of goods and services seems to be higher as well. And our travel cost, well, again, travel we can explain away by us not being on a well-serviced bus route, so we're having to commute into town to access goods and services. So, excuse me. And our food and diet is higher. Why our food and diet is higher, I haven't got an explanation for at the moment, but it's certainly worth thinking about. So, Harry, would you like to go on to the next slide, please? Right, shortfalls with the impact tool. This still remains unclear. Whilst the tool includes industrial and commercial buildings and the emissions therein, it's unclear whether community buildings are considered. Now, I have raised this with the Centre for Sustainable Energy, who developed the tool in conjunction with the University of Exeter. So are community buildings included under industrial and commercial, or are they excluded? I will get back to you, obviously, when I've got an answer on that. But if your community buildings aren't included, we can actually assess those locally. The next slide, please, Harry.
And that's...
All right. Has anybody got any questions? First of all, thank you very much for listening to me. Are there any questions you'd like to ask on the use of the tool?
There's some in the chat box, so I'm just going to deal with those first. I'll ask.
Oh yeah, please do. Yeah.
Roxy, if you wanted to ask your question for us.
Oh hi. I don't know which one you mean, but I'll go with the first one, which is it possible to link live data into, embed it into a website, like a town council website or a community group's website?
I've certainly not tried to do that, but as I say, as the graphs are interactive, it might well be difficult. So downloading the data into CSV format and then manipulating the data in Excel is relatively easy to do, and of course the graphs that I've shown you on the presentation were done through that methodology, and I can explain that in more detail should you wish.
Great, thank you.
I think we just go through them. Jill, if you wanted to ask your question.
I think it's really useful. The graphs are so clear, and I'm definitely going to show them to other councillors when that occasion arises. But I wondered, wasn't clear from not knowing what the data came from, how much these might change according to things that we might be able to do. For example, if households alter their consumption patterns, or if farming practices change, would that actually show up, or would we have to measure that locally?
There is a commitment from CSE to enable us to do what-if scenarios. As you actually implement your initiatives for reduction, we should be able to recalculate. Quite how they're going to do that, I don't know. Because it means obviously the base data that they're using is going to have to change. What we can do, of course, is that having established what the footprint is for that particular sector, all right, then we can put our reduction initiatives in place and say we can calculate what the savings are.
Thank you.
Anthony Adams.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Nice lead in there, Jill, actually. So my comment was, where we see from the analysis that a certain sector produces a certain amount of emissions, does the tool have a suggested, say, top 5 things that can be done to reduce those emissions? Help prioritise activity? Not
that I'm aware. I mean, if your contributor is the agricultural emissions, which it certainly is in the case of Bratton Fleming, then that's going to be by engagement with the landowners and the farmers to determine how we can actually reduce our emissions.